So your son has gone missing. Other young offspring have turned up gutted and completely shreked by an apparent wolf in the area, and all just a few weeks after you had an atrocity just completely committed against a group of people who were known for curses and magic. Do you A, bury your head in the sand and ignore it? 2, say you were actually seeking vengeance against the people you literally had hunted down like animals because somehow them retaliating is their fault? Or D, go and give yourself up to the curse so that, not everyone in your employment has to suffer? Well, if you chose 2, then bro, what is wrong with you? In jolly old England back in the day when apparently it wasn't so jolly but really just a cutthroat AF place I suppose, a town would be besieged by something that was believed to be an animal, as whoever was associated with the landowner and the land began to get got. This would obviously begin frightening people as an answer was looked for. Ultimately, a pathologist who had been tracking the group, who he would then go to their last known location, who was a landowner named Siamus. What was actually out there is worse than you could imagine. So in today's episode, we will talk about what this creature is, how it was created. We're going to have a little bit of suspension of disbelief because there are supernatural elements to this movie, and ultimately why the son may have survived to be normal at the end. So first things first, I'm going to switch it up. If you haven't actually seen this movie, I want you to go watch it. It was really good and a great horror movie. Then I want you to come back here so I can afford to feed my family this month. But obviously spoilers for this movie, so as per usual up on screen you will see a timestamp. You can bypass the summary and head there, but by just cited examples within the science portion, there's always going to be spoilers. And fair warning, it is like $20 to rent, but it was worth it. For all others choosing to stay, let's get to why you shouldn't just be a casual ass clown to groups of people, as surely there was more diplomatic ways of handling this situation. Or hiring mercenaries works as well. Ah, Siamus, you never fail to disappoint. Also, I just want to point out in the last video, yes, her name is Shee-von. We can all rejoice now. And also, I've been calling him Siamus just to make you upset. I know his name is Seamus. And lastly, yes, it's about World of Warcraft. I started a guild. If you play on Gribulus West Coast server, I'm trying to get to rating status. It's called Onyx Guard. Yes, it's a completely edgy name. We need people of any level, so we're gonna move on now. Okay, we start off the Cursed in 1917 in the Somme. As soldiers get ready to climb out of the trench, gas is dropped on them that immediately begins burning everyone. Man, I'll tell you, that looks freaking terrible. But as they begin their run through no man's land, the Germans open up with their standard exponential force multiplier, taking out soldiers in droves. One captain is immediately wounded to 3 shots to the abdomen, is brought to the medic tent where everyone isn't looking so hot. By the way, this movie is not afraid of cutting off limbs, and if I want to afford my house, some of this may have to be blurred. Anyhow, as the captain is put on the table, he begins singing nursery rhymes to himself because again, he's been shot 3 times in the abdomen, so I'm thinking maybe he's going into shock. So with no anesthesia, the doctor immediately begins pulling 2 bullets out of his guts. Now, if you ever hit in the guts with a bullet, you have about 15 minutes till bleed out, roughly. Unless you hit the abdominal aorta, in which case you will bleed out in about 30 seconds, and really, that's not getting fixed. So basically you have time to get right with God at that point. But judging by the blood released, it's not looking good. But as the doctor pulls out the 3rd bullet, it's shattered as it hit something in his abdomen. He ends up finding a large silver bullet, remarking that that's not a German round. And we now meet a woman named Charlotte. She's going to check on someone who looks at a photo before turning back around to see a kid named Edward teasing her that he has her book. She's now young, and we learn this is 35 years prior to the war that was supposedly the war to end all wars, but really it just made us better at warring, so whoops. That's kind of a classic humanity move. Meeting the whole family, we have Edward and Charlotte, which are the kids, Seamus outside hunting rabbits, and Isabel taking a bath. I have no idea why Seamus comes in and looks at her taking a bath and just looks like a disapproving father. This part is honestly a little bizarre, but hey, it's the 1800s, so who knows what cultural norms there were. I think maybe she's pregnant. I don't know. That's what my wife said, so I'm not sure. But now we flash over to a group of Romani people hanging out on the land. The matriarch of the group instructs a man to make the silver ready as a storm is coming, hinting that she has knowledge of the future because indeed a storm of turd Fergusons are coming. The man melts down the silver, forming them into teeth to create something that appears like an animal's mouth. Then the woman curses it. Later that night, the elders of the land are meeting as the kids sneak in to see what's going on. They are discussing the people on the land. They have claimed it as theirs. Seamus asks, is there any validity to this claim? And the Padre says, there is some validity, but it goes back over 80 years, so they can change the records in their favor. Good Lord, what a bunch of douches. They did try to offer them money to sell it, but they refused. So instead, they will use that money to hire a group of mercenaries, assuming that just the threat of violence will clear them out. But we all know this is probably going to go south quick. The next morning, the group rides out to clear them as one man begins arguing, which cause an engagement of force multipliers. This results in basically everyone getting knocked down regardless. Once the encampment is burned, some of them are dragged off to some fate, while most are dragged off to a trench that they have just dug. While this is happening, Seamus and the others take a picture as a trophy, so like, douche Olympics gold medalist right here. The matriarch and second in command dude are found and then pulled back to the captain of the mercenary band, where the guy then spits on him. Because of this, they make make an example and cut off his feet and hands. Good lord. And then they raise him up like a scarecrow. Now, I'm sure they were trying to make an example of him, but like everybody's already gone. So who are you making an example for? Anyways, the older woman is then buried alive with the teeth after the man who caught her told his captain that she tried to bite him. Back at the old Seamus homestead, the kids are singing with their mom and having a great time. But as they are told to go to bed at like 7 p.m., Charlotte has a dream of digging in the mud with the scarecrow whipping its head around and staring at the drone flying by. So we now jump over to an inn. The man coming in tries to get information from the innkeeper, but he's told to sign in and tell him where he's been, where he's going, and why he's here. Basically, England is in the grips of a cholera outbreak currently, which is just absolutely destroying the surrounding area, with most towns shutting down the entire town and not allowing outsiders in. Which, if you didn't know, cholera nowadays is completely survivable in first world countries. The basic key is just replacing electrolytes that are lost to the absolute buku amount of water that's going to be coming out of you. So drinking Gatorade through the infection and drinking as much water as possible will keep your electrolyte levels up as well as keep you hydrated. And that's really it. That's how you survive cholera. It's pretty wild, isn't it? Something that has plagued humanity in groups for so long, trounced by Gatorade. So now you know the number one way in order to survive cholera, and considering we're probably gonna blow ourselves up here in the next 50 years, you never know when you might need that information. Anyhow, food and drink is included with the room at the end, which is how I wish it was now. But as he sits there, the town lieutenant comes up to see what he's been doing, as clearly they know one another, or at least know of each other. The last pathologist got by cholera, but back at Seamus Estates, Edward has a dream of finding the scarecrow and digging through the dirt, as well as finding the teeth before looking out into a field and seeing the Romani matriarch approach. But now he's sleepwalking and ends up outside. I've been there, I've done that, and it is not fun. The following day, as the kids play, Timmy gets the group together and makes them swear not to say anything about what he's about to show them because his family will be kicked off the land. He talks about how they're all dreaming about the scarecrow, the fire, and the teeth. Timmy goes to dig it up and then actually does find the cursed teeth. He's compelled to put them in his mouth and immediately attacks Edward, biting him in the trapezius muscle. Charlotte then runs back and gets her dad and grandfather. They carry Edward back and get the doctor. Edward requests the room be dark as the light is hurting his eyes. Probably not a good sign. So now we hear a few things from the doctor that's actually pretty interesting. First, he believes it was a wild animal that attacked him, which is pretty standard. Second, he has a fever, which indicates the immune system response is active. And third, the wound is definitely infected, which means there's a biological catalyst to what appears to be happening to Edward. Also, my boy got the 1800s morphine, so he's about to feel really good. However, later that night, he isn't doing so well. Charlotte has dreams about the scarecrow again, and Timmy, and the bite, before the scarecrow grabs her head and she's awoken to Edward hyperventilating in his room. She goes to check on him and sees that he has these tendrils beginning to surround his body. Seamus gets up and only finds blood in his bed and an open front door. He runs out to find him before organizing a search party the next morning to look across the wider area. But of course, he is unsuccessful as he's not looking to be found. Later that night, Mommy Dearest sits at the table crying as they all eat, real downer stuff. But back at the inn, the lieutenant and the pathologist discuss the Romani. And I'm sure my pronunciation, somebody's gonna like, no, it's Romani or something like that. I don't know. I'm gonna say Romani. It's gotta be Romani. As Charlotte goes to the church, she ends up spotting Timmy, who's apparently been plagued by nightmares, and says he doesn't remember what happened after he was digging. He pulls a page out of the Bible mentioning Judas's silver and how the teeth must be made out of it. He hands Charlotte the page of the Bible and talks about how they will all pay for the sins of their fathers. Timmy gets found by the maid and then takes off out of the church before spotting Edward buck nude in the wilderness. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd follow him. As he heads out into a field, something is approaching that just straight up destroys his arm. As he's going into shock, he heads into the woods before finding an abandoned shack with Edward hot on his tail before ultimately being attacked by the creature. Later that day, the pathologist, who I guess I should actually just say his name now, it's John McBride, goes to Seamus's house. Seamus tells him things have gotten worse since they sent for him. They take John out to the abandoned shack where Timmy was attacked. John concludes it was a wild animal, but he knows something else is amiss because he finds a page of the Bible torn out with underlined passages. He comes out to tell them that it was a wolf, seemingly. John elects to stay for a few more days to find out what's actually going on. John begins asking Seamus what he remembers of the day Edward went missing. Talks about how his son had a bite mark on his neck, and after that night, he hasn't seen him since. John asks Isabel, is it possible that Edward just ran away, but she knows he wouldn't just nope out of the family band like that. John then begins retracing Edward's steps as he looks out over the creepiest landscape I've ever seen. He then says they need to board shut the lower windows as as a precaution because, standard precaution for when your child is missing. You wouldn't want them coming back. As John sleeps that night, he has the same dream everyone else has about the Scarecrow, except he gets some context of people digging a mass grave, but also finding the teeth and the old woman below, before ultimately seeing his family with the Scarecrow. 3 spooky 5 me stuff. After that calming night's sleep, he gets up and decides to wander around the house. Later that night, we begin to see some interesting things. Taking a sample from the door and putting it under a microscope, we see his blood cells actually have pseudopodia. Using his own blood, he puts a few drops onto the glass plate and checks. The tendrils of the red blood cells begin attacking the normal red blood cells and absorbing them into themselves. As he looks through, he hears thudding before looking back to the slats of the barrier, and oh god, the child is back. He tells Seamus to fetch a force multiplier because again, they don't want that kid back. John says that he's going to hunt the creature, but they also need to gather the elders to make sure that they are under armed guard before coming, as he needs to tell everybody to basically just stay in their homes. Later that night, the elders in the land meet to discuss what is attacking everyone, and John mentions again it's consistent with a wolf, but one elder appears to not believe him because he's a pathologist. He goes on to mention how he's dealt with a beast like this before, but it required the deployment of the army, and he needs to confirm that this thing is here. He tells them all to stay inside their house and board their windows shut. Early the next morning, a group is tasked with harvesting a crop. They're all pretty nervous, and they just start discussing, hey, we should probably stay within eyesight of one another and watch for anything. Well, anything is coming. The group gets attacked pretty quickly, ending 2 men before the woman is bitten on purpose to be infected, it looks like. She takes off from the fields, heading back to the settlement, where people grab her and take her in. The group then convenes at the field, pulling all that was left of the 2 men into the center of it, probably just to be used as fertilizer at this point. Heading to the woman's house, they find her bed empty and bloody handprints leading out to her window. John says that they need everyone out here to limit their exposure as he and his people are being hunted. Then flashing over to the woman, she's not looking so good. She's talking about needing water and then falls into a river and is completely wrapped up with tendrils. Wait a minute, what kind of movie is this again? Anyways, she begins turning into one of these creatures that is hunting everyone. And at this point, the people decide that it's probably good to just go to the church and lock the doors. That night, John and Isabel have a drink as they can't sleep, which, did you know, before the invention of electricity, people used to go to bed as soon as it got dark, wake up around 3 a.m., possibly even midnight, hang out, and then go back to bed a few hours later. It sounds terrible. But as they talk, Isabel begins dropping truth bombs about what's happening, but then is stopped by Seamus, who clearly is ashamed of what he's done. I guess you could call him a Seamus. John informs him tomorrow he will set traps to catch the beast, and set traps he does. Heading back to the abandoned shack, John finds the Scarecrow and immediately begins building a spike trap and setting bear traps as well. He gets some images of his wife and child being lowered into the ground, but also the woman, who recently was infected, is shown with tendrils coming out of her back, so that's probably not good. But somehow, John fell asleep during all this. It could not be me with a man-wolf-pig thing running around. But as he awakens, he realizes the creature is basically there with him. As it jumps to attack, he uses his bayonet to transfer its momentum into the spike trap, which mortally wounds it before he takes it out with a shot. Heading back to the house, he brings the creature into the barn in order to do an autopsy to make sure it was the right wolf thing. And I gotta tell you, taking these things out, it's not like it could really be the wrong one, even though he cuts it open and he reveals it's the wrong one, but get rid of as many as you can. So cutting it open, it reveals that it was the woman who was infected earlier. He yells at the caretaker there to basically take her out, as they never come back the same as they were, as tendrils begin sprouting again from her back. And finally, the man takes a shot, ending her. Seamus asks, is this the fate that befell his son? And, sorry, my dude, but you kind of earned this one. Seamus then says that he is the one seeking vengeance for what this thing has done to his family. And I'm not sure those stack up evenly, my dude. The next morning, Grandpa and Grandma are sent out to a more safe area as the family chooses to stay. Charlotte is upset, but hey, I'm sure they won't get completely destroyed in the woods just out of eyesight. Just, don't even worry about it. Now John is curious as to who is buried in the field. Isabel shows him a picture of Seamus as he took as a trophy at the conclusion of annihilating the Romani people. They now need to find this creature, so a whole group and a pack of like 50 dogs ride out in order to hunt this thing down, while John stays behind and asks Charlotte what she knows. Heading to the church, Charlotte shows him the jaws. John tells Saul to send for the army immediately so they can contain this thing. And why is everyone working when there's a murderous wolf-human hybrid on the loose? Who knows? The maid then goes outside like a giant nerd to get the laundry and realizes, something is is here. Whoops. She gets bitten in the arm and abdomen, but released because the hunting party is on its way back. She heads into the servants' quarters, cleans herself up, but that's a mega infection. Now utilizing the skills of a blacksmith, John is able to melt down the jaws made out of Judas's silver to create silver bullets. Seamus enters the home and finds the maid isn't looking so well. Considering cholera is ransacking the area, I'd probably say be a little more concerned about sick people, but John heads outside to light fires in varying distances to keep an eye on the field. As the maid goes to give everyone water, she heads into the kitchen as John spots blood on the sheets in the distance. He walks in asking if anyone is missing and then asks where the maid is. She hears this, but Seamus tells John he thinks he should leave. John basically tells him that he's here to help and accuses Seamus of knowing about the Romani claim to the land, but Seamus says he's lost his son, so that somehow equals out to the whole group being obliterated. What a turbo douche. John spills the beans about likely what is happening to Isabel as this sparks a fight. That night, Charlotte doesn't want to be alone, so Isabel stays the night with her as the maid is hyperventilating with tendrils coming to embrace her. Seamus can hear her screaming in the vents as it turns to growling. He goes and grabs a force multiplier and begins walking around the estate and checking on his daughter and wife. John now heads inside, leaving his force multiplier with the special bullets outside. Brilliant. Why do they always do that? Like I said, that thing would literally be glued to my hands. As Seamus goes to check on Anise, he finds that her bed is actually empty. However, as the candle's flames shift, he realizes that she's actually been turned into one of those things and then is attacked and bitten. John had already put the kettle on, likely coffee, as Seamus struggles with the beast. He now ends up taking it out with a shot, but he's going to turn now. Also, the house is on fire. That sucks. John heads downstairs, hearing Isabel screaming. He tells her to find Charlotte and get out of the house. Chasing Seamus to the barn, Isabel goes upstairs and finds Charlotte under the bed hiding. Finding Seamus, he's sitting there covered in oil and sitting in a pool of it as well. He talks about how he sees the flames and he deserves this and yada yada yada. So he lights himself on fire, which arguably has to be the worst way to go. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Edward has entered the building. Isabel and Charlotte go to escape but see Edward coming up the stairs looking for them. They are able to escape as some horses run by on fire, which made my wife sad. All three of them immediately run away from the burning building before Edward realizes that they aren't there. They then spot just beyond the reaches of the house, like literally in the front yard, Grandpa and Grandma did not make it. I mean, they didn't go very far at all. Edward then finds them next to the carriage, but it appears scared of the silver bullets and keeps its distance. They then begin a tightly packed run to the church with Edward on their tail the whole time. They bang on the church door until finally they get let in. Timmy's dad suggests that they go outside and find the creature and then fight it. John says that they have to wait for daylight so that they can have a clean shot, plus the military is supposed to be there in the morning. But you know, we can't just have a happy ending here. That would be crazy. As everyone sits down to catch some sleep, John tells Isabel what she wants to hear rather than what Seamus actually said. That night, however, as Isabel goes to pray for mercy against the creature, she hears Edward outside calling to her. She's overcome with mom brain at this moment and opens the door, letting the creature in as they aren't able to stop her in time. The creature begins biting and throwing people around like rag dolls before Isabel finally gets its attention and tells Edward enough. It comes at her and John tells her to get out of the way before being forced to take the shot through her, which then enters the abdomen of the creature, taking it out as well. As she lays there, her son exits the creature, really just is ejected from the creature, but he appears gone. Just as Isabel passes, her son then comes back to life, to which she never actually sees by mere seconds. Big oof. Then we see that the captain who had the silver bullet in his guts from earlier was actually Edward. Man, I bet you guys didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, the captain does not make it, so even after all of this, he still doesn't have like a full life. That's because war is quite brutal. So back in the past, John is a real stand-up guy and decides to adopt the children considering they're orphans now. He tells Edward that it's really not his fault what has happened, so he shouldn't blame himself. Then we see the woman visiting him at the beginning is by his side when John finally bites the dust. Apparently, the curse line has also been permanently broken as no more bullets had been used in his entire life. So the first thing we need to get out of the way right out of the gate is there is clearly some supernatural aspects to this, but there's some definite evidence to point to a biological one as well. Concerning the supernatural aspect, which can't really readily be explained, is the dreams or really the nightmares everyone seems to have all over the settlement. Now, a case could be made, as it always could, that magic is simply science we don't understand yet. I mean, bring someone back from the Dark Ages into the current era and they would assume that everyone was a witch. Give a caveman a Dorito and he would probably be ousted from the tribe, seeing as his incoherent ooga-dooga screaming about cheesy Doritos of the gods would probably drive everyone crazy. You know, things like that. But I see only one possibility concerning how everyone may have the dreams that they have, but to understand how it could be a potential, we must first talk about the biological infection associated with the cursed. So taking it back to where the cursed, I suppose, curse begins, getting to the teeth, these are obviously not normal teeth, but I believe they serve as a delivery method for an infection rather than the things actually causing the infection themselves. From what it looks like to me, the silver teeth teeth are set within the jawbone of some form of animal. Now, the strange thing is that it is melted down later, or potentially when the blacksmith is attempting to melt the teeth to create bullets, the jawbone surrounding the teeth had to be broken off. Possibly I simply missed that. But if the teeth are set within a jawbone, that could potentially explain what we see later, but I also think it's probably something else. Again, here's another supernatural element to a degree, but when Timmy finds the teeth, he is compelled to put them in. So the question is at that point, why? I think it is predicated on prior exposure to the actual cellular infection, almost like a protozoa parasite infection that appears to be ransacking the entire settlement. Again, stay with me on this one. We're about to test the boundaries of understood cellular activity. Taking it back to the Romani, we know the teeth were turned into silver, which was Judas's silver specifically, or at least that's what's hinted at. If you are not really familiar with Judas' silver, it's basically cursed because that's the silver he accepted in order to backstab Jesus. One could say not a pro-gamer move to betray your friend like that. But what's interesting is the Romani appear to have the silver with them, and they've used it previously before, as stated when the matriarch tells him to go make the silver ready again, a storm is coming, after denying the offer by the elders to leave the land. Because the silver is melted down and turned into something else, I believe the process would destroy any biological material that may have been associated with the silver itself. And considering they already had moved from another town that actually had an outbreak, that means these teeth were once again melted down and reformed into coins to be melted back down and reformed into teeth. To me personally, this clears the teeth of being the actual infection point. Again, I'm also hesitant to say that the jaw would be the infection factor here, as the jaw does appear to melt down once the blacksmith in the church destroys it. I could be wrong. Somebody mentioned this in the comments. But there is one more vector in which the infection could spread that I think is overlooked because of the simple fact that humans are superstitious. The Romani themselves. If they are melting and reforming the silver all this time, then the common denominator that doesn't change amongst all the interactions would be the people themselves and who is actually delivering the bite to start the infection process. The older woman and potentially even the guy who forms the jaws. I also believe there are some clues as to this happening that may even indicate how the infection spread beyond just the teeth. So let's back up even one more time. The movie itself is giving us clues as to what's going on and how things can be explained in biological terms if you look hard enough for them. I mean, really, explore the space looking for them, because I didn't even realize how to find them until I sat here with my third cup of coffee, wondering how it was able to potentially connect beyond something like, well, it's a curse, Roanoke. That's just what curses do, because that's just lame. So I would propose this. First, the main point of infection is spread by the older woman, as made mention by the man who grabbed her after she made a break for it once her settlement was attacked. She tried to bite me. She was not successful, as she is likely more frail, but something does happen that is interesting. The man spits on the captain. Now, transfer of diseases can take place in a lot of ways, really. And back in the 1800s, and before the advent of antibiotics, as you can see in this movie, or at least it's mentioned a lot, that there was already another disease going around, which I've mentioned how to survive earlier, and that is cholera. The whole movie is alluding to this disease throughout it, and much like how cholera is lethal unless you have Gatorade on hand, back in the day, and even in some countries today, it's still seen as a death sentence. But that's the point. I think the movie is trying to make a connection between the cursed and the current cholera outbreak going around, and I believe the medium by which the disease, or at least a form of the disease, travels uses the same lines as cholera. We see after the captain of the mercenary group is spit on that the old woman and man run to the woods trying to escape. Then everyone begins having nightmares, or the same nightmares after that. They see the Scarecrow more than anything, but also occasionally see the woman pointing at them or their family being taken away by the Scarecrow into the woods. Because of this, we can conclude that the entire settlement is infected with the curse, which happens quite quickly after the field was closed, but not so quickly that word doesn't seem to have spread or crops didn't have time to grow. We see that the group is being buried and the field is just essentially short grass at this point. Nothing has been planted, or at least the grass is shorter, and the dirt would still be disturbed. Because of this, we can conclude that at least a couple of weeks or maybe a month or two has passed since they have been buried and the grass has sprung up. Also, if I remember correctly, John says that he's been on the trail of the Romani for a little while now, and it went cold a few weeks prior, and it took him a while to find the town where he ended up. So when the woman is found, while not in what would be normal stages of decomposition, at least in the dream, she is in some form of it, which again takes time. With all this in mind, we can conclude that it's not the next day that everyone has the same dream, but instead took a while for it to spread to the settlement. However, once it did spread to the settlement, everyone was infected with the same visions and dreams. We also see throughout the movie there is an emphasis on drinking water. It's subtle for sure, but the way everything kind of like pans around water being poured into glass, I believe the movie is indicating that something is actually wrong with the water. Much like with cholera that is moving in the water from town to town, striking fear in people as they never know if they're actually actually infected or not, I believe that there is a literal biological infection in the water that took time to get to the settlement. However, it's not like the infection the woman has. Instead, the infection came from the man. Now, we have to use a bit of imagination to fill in the gaps, but when the woman and man made a run for it, we know that in the woods there is a river very close nearby. Potentially, I believe the water may have actually been seeded with the infection from the man at this point, and it's also possible that when he spits on the captain, that contains enough of the cells responsible for infecting others, and when the captain goes home to clean it off, the water is then infected as well. Either way, I believe there is an actual tangible contamination taking place that allowed everyone weeks later to have imbibed the cellular organism, which has now induced the same nightmares. Now, clearly, where it becomes supernatural is human brains are quite complex. Having the same nightmare for everyone in town seems a little odd no matter what sort of infection it is. People just don't link up like that in that capacity typically, and likely it would never have gone down like this. However, should this microbe exist that took time to incubate in the waterways and subsequently the people who drank it, then this could lend credence to the idea that this is really just an infection overall, and both the man and woman had it using teeth. Speaking of the woman, she appears to really have a different form of infection or a different way of delivering it. While potentially they could be the same, say if the man had bitten someone using the teeth, maybe he could have inspired the same sort of outbreak. I also believe it's possible that everyone after drinking the water is infected with the same disease at this point, but upon delivery to somewhere else, say like the bloodstream, directly, rather than just say your stomach, the effects are much more detrimental to your body. Which you may say sounds strange, but this outcome is quite common, so let's take a trip into immunology. So there is something that I fear more than any disease on Earth, well, except for maybe prions. It is known as a brain-eating amoeba. From the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh concerning the absolute inability of humans to clear this amoeba, it disgusted me. I craved the eosinophils and the certainty of antibodies. What is known as Naegleria fowleri is located down here with me, at least in the great state of Georgia, within the rivers, ponds, lakes, in our water, basically all over. This amoeba mostly slips by unnoticed. But every year, it sounds like we get at least one person or like one or two people who's unlucky and ends up with this thing entering their brain and just absolutely destroying the 3-pound chemoelectric anxiety meat. Now, the question is, why is this? Well, typically they are either immunocompromised, really young, or not from the area. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, it's based on prior exposure to this POS amoeba. How it works typically is if you drink the water down here in the south, the amoeba will enter your stomach. It will either be destroyed by the acid or your body will find it further down the intestinal tract, ask if it has a loison be causing a parasitic infection, and then destroys it because it does not. Once destroyed, your dendritic cells will take pieces of it back to B cells and remember the infection. Then, if you get water up your nose from a lake, pond, river, sewer system, faucet, whatever, your body will remember the parasite, have an immediate response, and destroy it before it can enter the brain. So it's pretty great, but that's the point of all this. I believe once the infected water is actually drunk by those in the settlement, their body destroys it as they are cells, which leads to no further interaction, such as changing their body. However, if a person is openly bitten and the cells directly into their bloodstream of a person, it's a completely different ballgame, which is why the teeth are necessary. Again, it's not the silver, at least in headcanon, that's causing the disease, it's an actual infection. But the question now becomes, what in the name of Judas Priest is this infection? Well, as we have seen with John when he's looking at it under a microscope, every cell that is infected appears to have multiple pseudopodia all over them. This would make the cells more mobile, and as we see, they're able to latch onto other cells with these arm-like protrusions. Pseudopodia, for your information, is typically a temporary protrusion of the cellular membrane that can be used to reach out and grab other cells or nutrition in the area in order to sustain the cell by utilizing microtubules and intermediate filaments. Basically, they can help the cell with movement and feeding. Where we see this most prominently featured, however, is within the infected blood cells of a person. These pseudopodia are more common in the protista kingdom, but have apparently arisen on the eukaryotic red blood cells. Using these protrusions, they can grab non-infected cells and pull them in for digestion, but on top of this, it extrapolates outwards too. So with the cells, so with the body. Long tendrils and filaments exit the body during the late stages of infection when they go from human to whatever this thing is, which wrap the host in a protective sac and form a new morphological beast around the person, which now we have arrived at the actual creature, as I think we have a fair understanding that this may be a biological infection. So let's talk about the creature and potentially where this infection came from. So first things first, the morphology of this animal is a lot like a wolf in some terms, but with a complete lack of body hair, much like a human. The skin pigmentation also matches the original person who was infected, which considering they're all British, it's essentially pasty white. Sorry my dudes, but I hear the sun doesn't shine much out there. The creatures will walk on all fours, longitudinal lines run the length of the body because the creature itself is nothing more than a covering of tendrils coming from the person, which obviously is fairly interesting. These tendrils appear to take on specialized roles as well, potentially taking direction from the actual genetic information from the person, which which means that the pseudopodias of the infected cells are absorbing and incorporating DNA from the human cell, and in some cases, like with the person themselves, it likely appears that they are replacing the human cells. Although there could be a difference between the person who is infected by a bite from the alpha versus a person who's bitten by the original fangs. The creature will take on, once again, the appearance of a hairless wolf with a smooth face and large teeth as well as claws, which indicates that if a human were on all fours, the placement of the claws in general would be where the fingernails are. The tendrils will form together with a connective tissue between them once the process has begun completely encasing the human inside to use them as almost as a template for genetic information. But again, it comes at a cost, which let's go over. It appears that there are two variants of infection. The teeth infection and the tendril infection. Those who are bitten by the teeth will receive the pure form of infection and remain themselves within the monster, but should silver be introduced into the actual body of the creature, then the tendrils will die and the person will be released in their natural form. Now, it's possible that the key is luck. When Edward Monsterface was hit with silver, it went through his mom, which slowed it down, then through the monster's tendrils, which slowed it down, then into his own gut at a glancing blow, which left the silver in his body. I've discussed before in my Dog Soldiers video, so I don't really want to rehash the entire thing that I said, but the point is if you didn't know, silver is cytotoxic and has cytotoxic effects by binding to certain proteins, which is quite interesting, as I would propose that the same proteins responsible for the tendrils and the pseudopodia amongst cells themselves may be affected by this silver bullet. If that is the case, that could mean that while the cells are replacing a person, which is why they really don't come back the same after they're freed from the tendril monster, with the introduction of pure silver into the body, it may subdue the proteins to a degree in the infected cells that have replaced the normal human cells, forcing them to act like normal cells, or at least allowing them to act like normal cells, which again, considering they are taking the genetic information, may compel them to do this. Then that raises the philosophical question: if you replace every cell in a person with a copy of their cell, are they still the original person? Which, if it's phrased like that, it sounds strange, but I think we all know our cells do this all the time. Most of the cells are not the same cells they were 10 years ago. I know someone's going to say actually, and that's why I said most. Neurological cells, immune cells, etc. They're all really the same cells. They're like ride or die cells. But okay, moving on. I think I actually just kind of disproved my point about the two variants. So I think it's the same variant. The only difference between Edward and the maid who was infected, or the woman in the field that just got a regular dose of lead, Edward likely would have expired as well if he took the full force of the silver round and it exited his body. But because of just the right circumstances of the speed of the silver bullet, the location of the bullet, and likely the protective sac adding repair mechanisms and his mom standing in the way, the silver from the bullet subdued the cells enough to behave like normal cells, which in the end saved him while others expired. So summation, yes, there are absolutely supernatural aspects. What the cells would have to do to actually inspire the same dream in everyone's head night after night would likely not be easily done. Talking about literally pulling the same neurons in the same order over and over again, or releasing potentially a chemical that would inspire this without affecting their waking life, just does not seem possible. But where it becomes biological is how it spreads. From the jaws of Timmy, who is instantly taken over, with his either bloodstream turning colors or the nerves turning colors, which knocks him out, suggests that something quickly entered the area. And again, potentially this could have been nerves firing along those lines with such force that it knocks him unconscious, but he's taken over and able to bite. To Edward being bitten and showing that his infected cells now have pseudopodia, which would indicate a conversion taking place, as well as the doctor saying that he had a fever. Again, this points to the immune system aware of something within the body and trying to attack it. And then to others, turning into the same beasts once they are infected, showing this disease can quite literally be passed to one another, person to person, if introduced into the bloodstream. To finally, the cytotoxic effects of silver, poisoning the cells to a degree to stop them from using specific proteins, which allows for the presentation of symptoms within the host, such as the tendrils on a macro scale, and on a micro scale, the pseudopodia. All of this comes together to me in a way to suggest a cellular disease, such as a supercell invasion of the body, that does actually appear to have a cure, or at least a treatment to stop symptoms and give the person a long-term normal life. But if not administered in the right way, they will permanently be changed and the tendrils will reform and the creature again will live if the person is removed from their meat mech and then not administered silver quickly.